The radar screen glowed green in the darkened Combat Information Center aboard USS Nicholas. 0138 hours, August 18, 1943. 11 miles northwest of Vella La Vella Island in the Solomon Chain. Lieutenant Commander Andrew Hill watched the phosphorescent blips crawl across the display for contacts moving south at high speed through the narrow waters they called the slot. Japanese destroyers. Tokyo Express. Coming down from Rabaul with their deadly cargo. Hill's Fletcher-class destroyer was one of 4 American tin cans racing north to intercept. They were outnumbered. The Japanese had speed, experience, and the most feared torpedo in the Pacific, the Type 93 Long Lance, a weapon that could kill at ranges American commanders refused to believe possible. What the Japanese didn't know, what they couldn't have known in the darkness of that moonless night, was that they were about to encounter something unprecedented in naval warfare. Not just a ship, but an industrial philosophy made manifest in steel. A weapons platform that would rewrite the rules of destroyer combat and transform American fortunes in the Pacific War. Within minutes, Nicholas and her sisters would open fire. 5 5-inch guns per ship, 20 rounds per minute per gun, a combined rate of fire exceeding 400 shells every 60 seconds. The mathematics of destruction were about to speak with a voice the Imperial Japanese Navy had never heard before. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how American industrial logic buried Japanese tactical excellence under an avalanche of steel. How questionnaires and spreadsheets produced the most successful destroyer class in history. And how 5 guns firing in a rhythm measured in seconds, not salvos, taught the Imperial Japanese Navy the terrifying cost of fighting America's industrial war machine. The problem began in 1939, before Pearl Harbor, before the Philippines fell, before anyone in Washington fully understood what kind of war was coming. The United States Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair sent out questionnaires, not to admirals or strategists, but to officers who actually operated destroyers at sea. The questions were simple. What armament would you want? How many guns? How many torpedo tubes? How many depth charges? At what point does the design become too large to be effective? The answers that came back represented accumulated wisdom from officers who understood destroyer warfare intimately. 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 torpedoes, 28 depth charges, speed between 35 and 38 knots. And most critically, forget the 1,500-ton limit that had constrained previous designs. Make it bigger. Make it work. Previous American destroyer classes had suffered from a fundamental problem. Naval technology was advancing faster than ship designs could accommodate it. The Navy kept trying to cram more equipment, more weapons, more capability into hulls designed for lighter loads. The result was top-heavy ships that handled poorly and couldn't be modified without risking stability. The questionnaire responses told designers what they needed to hear. Officers wanted a larger platform, something around 2,000 tons standard displacement, big enough to carry the weapons needed for modern warfare, stable enough to be modified as technology evolved, rugged enough to survive Pacific combat. The design that emerged would be designated the Fletcher class, named for Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher, a naval officer whose career bridged the old steam navy and the new oil-fired fleet. The lead ship, USS Fletcher, hull number DD-445, was laid down at Federal Shipbuilding in Kearny, New Jersey on October 2, 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor. The design parameters were revolutionary by destroyer standards. 376 feet 6 inches in length, 39 feet 7 inches in beam, 18 feet in draft. Standard displacement 2,150 tons, though combat-loaded ships would displace closer to 2,800. 2 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generating steam at 600 pounds per square inch and 850 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 General Electric geared turbines producing 60,000 shaft horsepower. 2 screws. Single rudder. Maximum speed, 38 knots. 37 in practice with wartime equipment loaded. Range, 4,790 nautical miles at cruising speed of 15.8 knots. Enough to cross the Pacific, fight, and return without refueling. A critical capability for operations in the vast oceanic theater. But the true innovation wasn't in the engineering plant. It was in the weapons. 5 Mark 12 5-inch 38 caliber guns and single Mark 30 enclosed mounts. The 5-inch 38 was already considered the finest dual-purpose naval gun in existence. Dual-purpose meant it could engage both surface targets and aircraft with equal effectiveness, a capability Japanese destroyers, with their separate main batteries and anti-aircraft weapons, could not match. The gun itself was a marvel of American engineering. 190 inches long, 38 times the 5-inch bore diameter. Weight of the gun assembly, 3,990 pounds. The barrel alone required 14,500 pounds of high-grade steel to forge. Each shell weighed 55 pounds. Muzzle velocity, 2,600 feet per second in a new barrel, 2,500 in a worn gun. Maximum range at 45 degrees elevation, 17,306 yards, nearly 10 miles. Maximum altitude at 85 degrees elevation, 32,250 feet, high enough to reach any aircraft flying in 1943. The killing power wasn't just in the shell's explosive force. It was in the rate at which those shells could be delivered. The Mark 30 mount featured an integral ammunition hoist system. In the handling room directly below each gun, sailors loaded shells and powder charges onto electric hydraulic hoists. The projectiles traveled nose down through the hoist, arriving at the gun house at waist height next to the projectile man. If the shell had a time fuse for anti-aircraft work, it was set automatically as it ascended, continuously updated by the fire control system. The powder charge followed in a separate scuttle, arriving next to the powderman's feet. Both men worked in a choreographed rhythm perfected through endless drilling. Projectile into the chamber. Powder charge rammed behind it. Breech block closed. Gun ready. The entire cycle took less than 3 seconds with a trained crew. Nominal rate of fire, 15 rounds per minute. But that was conservative. Gun crews aboard destroyers in the Solomons discovered they could sustain 22 rounds per minute during combat. Some crews claimed they'd achieve 25 rounds per minute for short bursts, though that pushed the equipment to its absolute limits. 22 rounds per minute per gun. 5 guns per ship. 110 shells every 60 seconds. The Fletcher-class destroyer could throw more than 2 tons of high explosive downrange every minute of sustained combat. For comparison, the Japanese Fubuki-class destroyer, considered the finest destroyer in the world when introduced, mounted 6 5-inch guns and twin turrets. But Japanese 5-inch guns fired at roughly 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Total sustained firepower, about 60 rounds per minute for the entire ship. The Fletcher fired nearly twice as fast, and the Fubuki was the high-water mark of Japanese destroyer design. Most Japanese destroyers encountered in the Solomons were older Shiratsu or Kajiro-class ships with 6 5-inch guns, but similar rates of fire. Some, like the ancient Mitsuki and Kamikaze classes still in service, had only 4 or 5 guns. The firepower differential was overwhelming. But firepower meant nothing without accuracy. The Fletcher class was the first American destroyer designed from the keel up to integrate radar fire control. The Mark 37 gun fire control system linked all 5 guns to a central director. The director, that distinctive cylindrical structure high on the mast, housed the Mark 12 fire control radar and Mark 22 height finder. Later in the war, these were replaced by the Mark 25 radar, but the principle remained the same. The radar measured range and bearing to the target. The Mark 1A fire control computer, an analog mechanical computer weighing thousands of pounds, calculated firing solutions continuously, adjusting for target speed, target course, wind, ship's motion, even the rotation of the Earth for long-range shots. The Mark 6 gyroscope, spinning at 8,500 revolutions per minute, kept the system stable even as the ship rolled and pitched in heavy seas. The computed solution was transmitted electrically to all 5 guns simultaneously. The guns trained and elevated automatically. When all guns reported ready, the fire control officer squeezed his trigger. All 5 guns fired together within a fraction of a second. From radar detection to first salvo, as little as 30 seconds. Japanese destroyers in 1943 had nothing comparable. They aimed their guns using optical rangefinders. Excellent devices in clear weather and good visibility, nearly useless in darkness, rain, or smoke. Japanese fire control was manual, calculated by officers using mechanical plotting tables, transmitted to gun crews by voice tube or sound-powered telephone. It worked, but it was slow, and it was blind beyond visual range. The Fletcher's radar could detect surface targets at 10 to 12 miles in good conditions. The SG Surface Search Radar, introduced in 1942, was the finest naval search radar in existence. It gave American destroyer captains eyes in the darkness that Japanese commanders could not match. But the guns were only part of the Fletcher's arsenal. 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple centerline mounts. The Mark 15 torpedo wasn't the equal of Japan's Long Lance. American torpedoes were slower, shorter-ranged, and notoriously unreliable in the war's first year. But they worked well enough when they hit, and the Fletcher could ripple-fire all 10 tubes in seconds, saturating an engagement zone with overlapping tracks. More importantly, Fletcher crews learned to use their torpedoes tactically. While Japanese destroyers led with torpedoes, their primary weapon, American destroyers led with guns and held torpedoes in reserve. If the enemy closed to short range, torpedoes provided a devastating backup. If radar-directed gunfire destroyed the enemy at long range, the torpedoes never had to be fired. This preserved a psychological advantage. Japanese commanders knew American destroyers carried torpedoes. They maneuvered defensively, wasting precious time evading attacks that never came, while American 5-inch guns found their range and began landing salvos. The anti-aircraft battery evolved throughout the war. Early Fletchers mounted a single quadruple 1.1-inch gun between mounts 3 and 4, backed by 6 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The 1.1 was quickly replaced by twin 40mm Bofors mounts, infinitely more reliable and far more effective. By June 1943, new Fletchers were commissioning with 10 40mm guns in 5 twin mounts and 7 20mm guns. By 1945, as the kamikaze threat intensified, some ships sacrificed 1 quintuple torpedo mount for additional anti-aircraft weapons, mounting up to 14 40mm guns in a combination of twin and quad mounts. The depth charge battery rounded out the weapon's fit. 2 depth charge racks on the fantail, capable of dropping patterns of charges set to different detonation depths. 6 K-gun projectors amidships could throw depth charges in arcs to either side of the ship, creating diamond patterns around submerged submarines. Later in the war, many Fletchers received Hedgehog ahead-throwing weapons, multiple mortars that lobbed 24 contact-fused charges ahead of the ship, allowing attacks without losing sonar contact. Still later, some ships received the experimental Weapon Alpha system, another ahead-throwing weapon designed for faster attacks against modern submarines. But in 1942 and 43, as the first Fletchers joined the Pacific Fleet, their true advantage wasn't any single weapon. It was the integration. Radar to detect, fire control to aim, guns to destroy, torpedoes for close-range punch, anti-aircraft weapons for defense, depth charges for submarines, and a hull large enough, stable enough, and tough enough to carry it all through typhoons, combat, and the endless grinding operations of a Pacific war. The Fletcher was a weapons system, not just a ship. USS Fletcher, the named ship, was commissioned on June 30, 1942. By then, Bath Iron Works in Maine, Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey, Bethlehem Steel in California, Boston Navy Yard, Charleston Navy Yard, Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama, Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding, and Consolidated Steel in Texas were all building Fletchers in parallel. At peak production, a new Fletcher-class destroyer joined the fleet every 5 days. 175 would be completed before the war ended, more than any other destroyer class in American history, more than the combined production of all previous American destroyer classes since 1917. The first Fletchers arrived in the Pacific in late 1942 and immediately deployed to the Solomon Islands, where American forces were locked in a desperate struggle for Guadalcanal. The campaign had become a grinding attrition battle. Japanese forces held the northern half of the island and a crucial airfield. American Marines held Henderson Field in the south. Both sides were reinforcing through a gauntlet of air and naval forces that turned the waters around Guadalcanal into a graveyard. The Japanese ran their reinforcements down a channel through the Solomon Islands that American sailors called the slot. Fast destroyer runs at night, taking advantage of superior Japanese night-fighting doctrine and the deadly Long Lance torpedo. They called it the Tokyo Express. The Americans called it the Rat Run. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy fought 7 major surface actions in the waters around Guadalcanal. The Japanese won most of them. American heavy cruisers USS Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, Atlanta, Juneau, and Northampton were sunk. Heavy cruisers Chicago, Portland, San Francisco, and New Orleans were heavily damaged. Light cruiser Helena was torpedoed but survived for a while. The Japanese lost destroyer Fubuki, battleship Hai, and several other warships, but their numerical losses were lighter. More importantly, they demonstrated consistent superiority in night fighting. Japanese lookouts spotted American ships before American lookouts saw them. Japanese torpedo men launched spreads of long lances with devastating accuracy. Japanese destroyer captains maneuvered aggressively, confident in their weapons and their training. The arrival of radar began to shift the balance. American ships could see Japanese formations before visual contact, but seeing the enemy and effectively engaging him were different problems. Early American radar-guided fire control was unreliable. Gun crews were still learning to trust the equipment, and American cruiser captains, commanding the surface task forces, often made tactical errors that negated their technological advantage. USS Fletcher herself was present for the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 12 through 15, 1942. The sprawling 3-day engagement saw some of the most brutal close-range combat in naval history. Fletcher fired guns and torpedoes in the chaos of the night battle on November 13, possibly helping damage the Japanese battleship Hai, which was finished off by aircraft the next day. But Fletcher's real contribution to the Solomon Islands campaign came in February 1943. On February 11th, circling off the coast of Guadalcanal, Fletcher's lookouts spotted a smoke float dropped by an aircraft from cruiser Helena. The float marked the position of a downed Japanese bomber crew. But as Fletcher approached to investigate and possibly take prisoners, the crew realized they'd spotted something more significant. The ocean surface was disturbed, not by wreckage, but by a periscope wake. Japanese submarine. Fletcher's captain maneuvered immediately for a depth charge attack. The destroyer made 3 runs, dropping patterns of charges set for different depths. Underwater explosions threw geysers of water into the air. The 3rd run brought debris to the surface, wood planking, clothing, oil. The submarine was identified as I-1, a large Japanese fleet boat that had been stalking American transports. I-1 was the first Japanese submarine sunk by a Fletcher-class destroyer. It would not be the last. By war's end, Fletcher-class ships would account for 29 confirmed Japanese submarine kills. But submarine hunting, while critical, wasn't what made the Fletchers famous in the Solomons. It was the night surface actions, the destroyer duels, the fast, violent engagements where American radar and firepower met Japanese torpedoes and night fighting expertise in narrow waters where there was no room for error. USS Nicholas, hull number DD-449, was laid down 3 days after Fletcher, March 3, 1941. She commissioned on June 4, 1942, and arrived in the South Pacific in September. By January 1943, Nicholas was operating with the Cactus Striking Force, Task Force 67, conducting raids up the slot to hammer Japanese positions. On January 4th and 5th, Nicholas bombarded the newly constructed Japanese airfield at Munda. On January 19th, she shelled the Cochabona Cape Esperance area, cutting off Japanese escape routes as American forces closed in on the last Japanese positions on Guadalcanal. On January 23rd and 24th, she blasted Japanese supply dumps at Vila on Kolombangara Island. On January 26, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Hill took command of Nicholas. 4 days later, his ship would face its first real test. February 1, 1943. Nicholas was covering the landing of the 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry at Veracruz on western Guadalcanal, part of Operation Key, the Japanese evacuation of the island. The landing went smoothly. Nicholas and her sister ship De Haven, another Fletcher-class destroyer, began escorting the landing craft back to Tulagi. At approximately 1300 hours, radar detected aircraft. Multiple contacts, closing fast from the north. 14 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers. Imperial Japanese Navy carrier aircraft, now flying from land bases after most of their carriers had been sunk. The Vals attacked in groups, screaming down from altitude with their characteristic vertical dive. They targeted De Haven first. 3 bombs hit the destroyer in quick succession. 1 detonated in the forward magazine. The explosion broke the ship in half. De Haven sank in less than 2 minutes. 167 men went down with her. Nicholas opened fire with every weapon that could bear. 5 5-inch guns firing radar-directed bursts. Twin 40mm mounts tracking targets across the sky. 20mm Ehrlichons hammering away at close range. The sky filled with tracer fire and shell bursts. Gun camera footage and action reports credited Nicholas with shooting down 8 Japanese aircraft. 8 confirmed kills in a single engagement, an extraordinary score for a single ship. But the Vals got through. 2 near misses straddled Nicholas, close enough that the underwater explosions damaged her steering gear and killed 2 sailors from shrapnel. For the next 3 hours, Nicholas maneuvered with limited steering while her damage control teams worked to restore full control. She also picked up survivors from De Haven, those who had made it off the ship before she went down. The action demonstrated both the Fletcher's strengths and the desperate nature of the Guadalcanal campaign. The radar-directed 5-inch guns had been devastatingly effective against the dive bombers. The Fletcher's robust construction had absorbed near-miss damage that would have crippled a smaller destroyer. But no amount of firepower could protect every ship from a determined air attack. More importantly, the action revealed something about the Fletcher design philosophy. When hit, the ships didn't disintegrate. The combination of flush deck construction, careful compartmentalization, and robust damage control systems meant Fletcher-class destroyers could absorb tremendous punishment and continue fighting. Later analyses would show this was deliberate. American naval architects had studied combat reports from the Atlantic and from early Pacific engagements. They understood that destroyers would be hit. The question was whether they would survive the hit long enough to complete their mission or withdraw to fight another day. The Fletchers were designed to take a punch and keep punching back. Through February and March 1943, as Guadalcanal was finally secured, Fletcher-class destroyers continued their bombardment missions up the slot. They shelled Japanese positions on New Georgia. They escorted supply convoys. They hunted submarines. They learned their business in the crucible of near-continuous combat operations. By April, crews had gained confidence in their ships and their weapons. The 5-inch guns proved reliable, accurate, and devastatingly effective. The radar-directed fire control meant they could engage targets at night or in poor visibility with precision Japanese destroyers couldn't match. The ships handled well, responded quickly to helm commands, and could maintain high speeds for extended periods without mechanical breakdowns. Most importantly, the crews were learning tactics that played to their strengths. Don't close to torpedo range unless necessary. Use radar to detect at long range. Open fire with guns while the enemy is still trying to locate you visually. Put enough shells in the air that even if individual guns aren't perfectly aimed, the sheer volume of fire guarantees hits. Keep firing until the target is destroyed or withdrawn. Overwhelm with firepower. The American way of war. The Battle of Kula Gulf on July 5 through 6, 1943, would demonstrate what Fletcher-class destroyers could do when employed correctly. American intelligence learned that Japanese destroyers were planning another Tokyo Express run, bringing reinforcements to Vila on Kalimbangara. Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth assembled Task Group 36.1 to intercept 3 light cruisers, Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis, backed by 4 destroyers. The destroyers included Nicholas and her sister ship Radford, both Fletchers. The force transited up the slot on the night of July 5, radar sweeping ahead for contacts. At 0106 hours on July 6, radar detected the Japanese formation at 12,000 yards, less than 7 miles. The Japanese force consisted of 3 destroyer transports carrying troops and supplies, escorted by 7 combat destroyers. They were strung out in a long column, destroyer transports in the rear, combat destroyers screening ahead. Ainsworth's cruisers opened fire at 0157, radar-directed salvos from their 6-inch guns. The Japanese were caught by surprise. Their lookouts hadn't spotted the American ships in the darkness. Within minutes, the Japanese flagship, light cruiser Jinsu, was hit repeatedly and set ablaze. She would sink with heavy casualties, including the task force commander. But the Japanese destroyers responded with their primary weapon, torpedoes, long lances, launched at long range based on estimated American positions. At 0208, Helena took a torpedo hit, then another, then a third. The light cruiser lost power, slowed, and began listing. Ainsworth ordered the other cruisers to continue northwest, chasing what he believed were crippled Japanese ships. Nicholas and two other destroyers, O'Bannon and Taylor, were detached to assist Helena and rescue survivors. At 0238, a fourth torpedo hit Helena. The light cruiser broke in half and sank rapidly. Nicholas, Radford, and destroyer Taylor circled in the darkness, searching for Helena's survivors. Men were scattered across several square miles of ocean, clinging to debris, floating in life jackets, calling out in the night. The three destroyers moved slowly through the water, searchlights playing across the surface, sailors throwing lines, and scrambling nets over the side. At 0240, radar detected contacts emerging from Kula Gulf. Japanese destroyers. Coming back. Hill faced an impossible choice. Hundreds of men remained in the water. Continuing the rescue meant exposing his ships to torpedo attack while stationary, the worst possible tactical position. Withdrawing meant abandoning sailors to die of exhaustion, exposure, or shark attack. He ordered the rescue to continue. Nicholas and her sisters would stay. The Japanese destroyer Amajiri, part of the force that had torpedoed Helena, approached from the north. Her captain saw the American destroyers illuminated by their own searchlights. He maneuvered for a torpedo attack. Nicholas detected Amajiri at approximately 7,000 yards. The fire control radar locked on. The solution was computed and transmitted to all 5 guns. At 0255, Nicholas opened fire. 5 5-inch guns firing 20 rounds per minute each. 100 shells per minute. The mathematics of destruction, expressed in steel. Amajiri took 5 direct hits in the opening salvo. 1 shell penetrated her hull near the waterline. Another detonated against her forward superstructure, killing 10 crew members instantly. A third destroyed her searchlight platform. The Japanese destroyer turned away, laying smoke, increasing speed, withdrawing from the engagement. Nicholas ceased fire. The rescue continued. At 0330, radar detected more contacts. 3 Japanese destroyers this time, approaching from different bearings. Hill ordered the rescue suspended. The 3 American destroyers formed line ahead, increasing speed to flank, preparing for combat. Then the Japanese withdrew. They had accomplished their mission, landing troops at Vila, and had no desire to fight a night engagement against radar-equipped American destroyers. Nicholas resumed rescue operations. At 0445, Japanese destroyers appeared for a third time. Again, Nicholas and her sisters prepared for battle. Again, the Japanese withdrew without engaging. At 0530, with dawn approaching and Japanese aircraft certain to appear with daylight, Hill finally ordered the task force to withdraw. Nicholas had rescued 291 Helena survivors. Radford had rescued 155. Taylor picked up another 54. More than 700 sailors were saved from Kula Gulf that night. The Presidential Unit citation awarded to Nicholas and Radford stated the facts plainly. After waging a vigorous battle, the Nicholas remained behind to save survivors. Forced to clear the area on 3 occasions during rescue operations, she gallantly fought off continuing attacks by Japanese warships, sank or damaged enemy ships with deadly torpedo and gunfire, and returned to the area after each onslaught to complete the heroic rescue. Admiral Chester Nimitz presented the citation to Nicholas's crew at Pearl Harbor on January 29, 1944. He told them the award was a token of the respect and esteem which this ship, her officers, and men have well earned throughout the Navy. What Nimitz didn't mention, what Nicholas's crew already understood, was that their actions represented something unprecedented in naval warfare. They had fought a superior Japanese force to a standstill while conducting rescue operations. They had used radar to detect and engage enemy destroyers before visual contact. They had demonstrated that the Fletcher-class destroyer, properly employed, could dominate night surface actions that Japanese destroyers had owned for 2 years. The Battle of Kula Gulf was not a decisive American victory. Helena had been sunk. The Japanese had successfully landed their troops. But the action demonstrated that the tide was turning. American destroyers no longer withdrew when Japanese destroyers appeared. They stood and fought. And increasingly, they won. 1 week later, Nicholas led the battle line down Kula Gulf again. The Battle of Kalimbangara on July 12 through 13, 1943. This time the Japanese had a light cruiser, Jintsu, along with 5 destroyers. The Americans had 3 light cruisers and 10 destroyers, including Nicholas. The engagement began at 0108 when American radar detected the Japanese formation at 12 miles. The cruisers opened fire at 0112, radar-directed salvos from their 6-inch guns. The Japanese cruiser Jintsu took multiple hits and exploded in flames. She would sink with heavy casualties. But the Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes. Long lances, fired at extreme range based on radar plot estimates of American positions. At 0123, cruiser Leander took a torpedo hit that tore open her bow. She withdrew, listing and down by the head. At 0129, cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis were both torpedoed. Honolulu lost her bow forward of turret 1. St. Louis took a hit that flooded multiple compartments. The American cruisers withdrew. The destroyers continued the fight. Nicholas and 9 other tin cans chased the Japanese destroyers north through Kula Gulf, firing guns and torpedoes, trading hits with an enemy that refused to stand and fight. By 0200, the Japanese had withdrawn. They had lost their cruiser but damaged 3 American cruisers in exchange. Nicholas had fired 287 5-inch shells and launched all 10 torpedoes. She took no hits. Her radar had tracked targets throughout the engagement. Her fire control had delivered accurate solutions even while maneuvering at high speed. Her guns had kept firing when other ships' weapons jammed from sustained rapid fire. The Fletcher was proving itself in the crucible. Not perfect, but reliable. Not invincible, but tough. And backed by an industrial system that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The numbers told the story of industrial war. By August 1943, Bath Iron Works in Maine was completing 1 Fletcher every 12 days. Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey was matching that pace. Bethlehem Steel in California, Boston Navy Yard, Charleston Navy Yard, Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama, Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding, and Consolidated Steel in Texas were all producing Fletchers in parallel. Average time from keel laying to commissioning, 364 days. Faster than any previous American destroyer class by 10%. Each ship required 2,150 tons of steel, 60,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 60,000 shaft horsepower of turbines and boilers, 5 Mark 12 5-inch guns with their associated fire control radars and computers. The production chain was staggering in its complexity and efficiency. Electric Boat Company manufactured the Mark 30 gun mounts. Ford Instrument Company produced the Mark 1A fire control computer. General Electric built the turbines. Babcock and Wilcox delivered the boilers. Raytheon supplied the radar components. Each company coordinated delivery schedules to ensure components arrived at the shipyards precisely when needed. Quality control was maintained through standardization. Every Fletcher was identical to every other Fletcher, aside from minor modifications introduced during production runs. This meant spare parts were completely interchangeable. A barrel from one ship would fit any other ship. An ammunition hoist from Fletcher could be installed in Nicholas. A fire control computer damaged in battle could be replaced with a unit from any supply depot. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Japanese destroyers were individually built to varying standards. Parts were not interchangeable between ships. Repairs required specialized components that often had to be fabricated on-site. A Japanese destroyer damaged in battle might spend months in a shipyard being rebuilt. An American destroyer with similar damage would be patched at a forward base and sent back into action within weeks. By January 1944, 50 Fletchers were in commission. By July, 100. By the end of 1944, 163. The final 12 commissioned between January and February 1945. 175 Fletcher-class destroyers. The largest single class of destroyers ever built by any nation. More than all Japanese destroyer classes combined. Each one cost approximately $6 million. roughly equivalent to 90 million in 2025 currency. The total program represented over $1 billion in wartime spending. But they delivered. 29 confirmed Japanese submarine kills. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft shot down. Thousands of shore bombardment missions. Tens of thousands of convoy escort missions. They screened every major carrier task force. They supported every amphibious landing from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They fought in every major naval engagement in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. Nicholas exemplified the class. By September 1943, she had participated in 11 major actions. She had bombarded Japanese positions on 6 different islands. She had shot down 14 confirmed enemy aircraft. She had helped sink Japanese submarine I-1. She had rescued Helena survivors under fire. She wore 3 battle stars on her Presidential Unit Citation ribbon. And she was just one ship. O'Bannon, her sister, would earn 17 battle stars, more than any other American destroyer. Fletcher herself would earn 15. Radford earned 14. Taylor earned 13. Dozens of Fletchers earned 10 or more battle stars each, representing participation in multiple campaigns across years of continuous combat operations. The August 18, 1943 action off Vella La Vella demonstrated how Fletcher tactics had evolved. 4 American destroyers, Nicholas, O'Bannon, Taylor, and Chevalier, were ordered to intercept Japanese destroyers attempting to establish a barge base on the island's northern coast. Captain Thomas Ryan, commanding from Nicholas, received reports that 4 Japanese destroyers were escorting troop-laden barges toward Hiraniu. Ryan's destroyers transited up the slot at high speed. At approximately 0056, radar detected the Japanese formation at 14,000 yards. The Japanese destroyers Sazanami, Hamikase, Isokase, and Shigure were screening the barge convoy, unaware that American ships were approaching in the darkness. Ryan maneuvered for a torpedo attack. At 0056, he ordered his column to turn 60 degrees to port, bringing all torpedo tubes to bear on the Japanese formation. At the same moment, the Japanese spotted the American force and opened fire. Their first salvo overshot by a quarter mile. They hadn't determined range accurately in the darkness. Nicholas and her sisters returned fire with guns while continuing to maneuver for torpedo launch. But Ryan recognized that the Japanese destroyers were positioning themselves between his force and the vulnerable barges. If he pursued the torpedo attack against the destroyers, the barges would escape. If he bypassed the destroyers to attack the barges, he'd expose his column to Japanese torpedoes. He chose a third option: engage the destroyers with guns while maneuvering to cut off the barge's escape route. For the next 13 minutes, the 2 destroyer forces exchanged fire at ranges between 7,000 and 12,000 yards. The Japanese destroyers Hamikase and Isokase both took hits. But the American ships remained undamaged, their radar-directed fire more accurate than Japanese optical gunnery in the darkness. At 0103, the Japanese destroyers withdrew to the north, increasing speed and laying smoke. Ryan turned east to pursue the barges. He found them scattered along the northern coast of Vella La Vella, hiding in the radar shadow of the island's mountainous terrain. Over the next 2 hours, Nicholas and her sisters hunted them systematically. 2 submarine chasers were sunk, 2 motor torpedo boats destroyed, 1 armored barge blown apart, 5 vessels eliminated. But most of the troop-carrying barges escaped by running themselves ashore and hiding under the jungle canopy. The action was tactically inconclusive. The Japanese had lost some vessels, but succeeded in landing their troops. But strategically, the engagement demonstrated American dominance. For Fletcher-class destroyers had engaged 4 Japanese destroyers and driven them off. The radar-directed gunnery had been devastatingly accurate. The American ships had taken no damage while inflicting significant casualties. Japanese destroyer captains were learning what Luftwaffe pilots had learned about American heavy bombers. You could damage them. You could hurt them. But they kept coming back, and there were always more of them. The industrial disparity was crushing. In 1943, American shipyards launched 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, 58 Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers with twin 5-inch gun mounts, and began construction of the Gearing-class, an enlarged Fletcher with even greater range. That same year, American yards also delivered 6 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 50 escort carriers, 2 battleships, 13 cruisers, 238 submarines, and thousands of landing craft, transports, and auxiliary vessels. Japan launched 15 destroyers in 1943. Total, across all shipyards. The disparity wasn't 2-1 or 5-1. It was more than 10-1 in destroyer production alone. And American ships were larger, more capable, more heavily armed, and more survivable than their Japanese equivalents. The Fubuki-class destroyer that had been the wonder of the world in 1928 displaced 1,828 tons and mounted 6 5-inch guns. The Fletcher displaced 2,150 tons standard and mounted 5 5-inch guns with superior fire control. The Japanese Kajiro class, introduced in 1939 as an improved Fubuki, displaced 2,000 tons and carried the same armament as ships built a decade earlier. Japanese destroyer design had stagnated. American destroyer design had evolved, and American production capacity dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. Consider the ammunition expenditure. Nicholas alone fired over 10,000 5-inch shells during her Solomon's campaign. That represented 275 tons of ammunition, more than the empty weight of an entire Japanese destroyer. Multiply that across 175 Fletchers, and the total ammunition consumption exceeded 48,000 tons. Just for 5-inch shells. Just for Fletchers. Not including cruiser shells, battleship shells, aircraft bombs, or any other ordnance. American industry produced it all. Lake City Arsenal in Missouri manufactured 300 million rounds of small arms ammunition monthly. Radford Army Ammunition Plant in Virginia produced 5 million pounds of smokeless powder monthly. The Naval Ammunition Depot at Crane, Indiana, stored millions of shells in hundreds of bunkers spread across 50,000 acres. Trains carried ammunition to ports. Ships transported it across the Pacific. Supply ships transferred it to destroyers at sea. The entire chain operated continuously, feeding the fleet's insatiable appetite for ordnance. Japanese industry could not match it. Japanese ammunition production was constrained by raw material shortages. Copper for shell casings, nitrates for explosives, high-grade steel for projectiles. Japan imported most of these materials through shipping routes that American submarines were systematically destroying. By late 1943, Japanese destroyers were experiencing ammunition shortages. Ships returned from missions with their magazines half empty because there were no shells to reload them. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 1st through 2nd, 1943, demonstrated the American advantage. 4 American light cruisers and 8 destroyers engaged 4 Japanese heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers in the approaches to Bougainville. The engagement was chaotic, with ships maneuvering at high speed in darkness, firing at radar contacts, trying to avoid friendly fire while engaging enemy vessels. The Japanese had superior numbers and heavier ships. They should have won decisively. Instead, they lost light cruiser Sendai and destroyer Hatsuke sunk, 3 cruisers damaged. The Americans lost destroyer Foot, which took a torpedo hit that blew off her stern, but she survived and was towed to safety. All other American ships withdrew under their own power. The difference was radar fire control and sustained firepower. American destroyers fired continuously throughout the engagement, putting hundreds of shells into the darkness based on radar plots. Japanese ships fired in salvos, carefully aimed based on visual observations that were increasingly difficult to obtain as smoke and darkness obscured the battlefield. American ships could see through darkness. Japanese ships were blind. By December 1943, Japanese destroyer doctrine was shifting from offensive to defensive. The Tokyo Express runs continued, but Japanese commanders were increasingly reluctant to risk their dwindling destroyer force in surface engagements. They avoided combat when possible. They withdrew when American destroyers appeared. They concentrated on getting troops ashore and escaping before American radar brought down the hammer of 5-inch gunfire. The numbers were undeniable. In 1942, Japan had 141 destroyers in commission. By the end of 1943, despite building 15 new destroyers, they had only 127. They'd lost more ships than they'd built. In 1944, they would lose another 43 destroyers while building only 9 replacements. The United States entered 1944 with over 250 destroyers in commission, including 112 Fletchers. By the end of the year, They would have over 400 destroyers, more than Japan had built in the previous 20 years combined. The Fletcher class was not a technological wonder weapon. It didn't have the sleek lines of Japanese destroyers. It didn't carry the terrifying long lance torpedo. It couldn't match Japanese destroyers in top speed. Most Japanese destroyers could make 35 to 38 knots against the Fletcher's 37. But the Fletcher had radar. It had 5 guns that fired 20 rounds per minute each. It had armor that let it absorb hits that would have sunk a Japanese destroyer. It had damage control systems that kept it fighting after taking punishment. And most importantly, when one Fletcher was sunk, 3 more appeared to take its place. USS Nicholas operated continuously through 1944. She screened carrier task forces during the Marshall's Campaign. She bombarded Japanese positions on Kwajalein. She participated in the invasion of the Marianas, providing gunfire support for troops landing on Saipan and Tinian. She was present at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, though she didn't engage surface targets. The battle was fought entirely by aircraft. On October 20, 1944, Nicholas was part of the invasion force for Leyte in the Philippines. She escorted reinforcement convoys to the landing beaches. On October 25, as Japanese surface forces attempted to disrupt the American landings, Nicholas patrolled off Dinagat Island, ready to respond to any threats that broke through the covering forces. The battle off Samar, fought that morning, demonstrated what happened when Japanese surface forces encountered American escorts without the advantage of surprise or darkness. Destroyer Johnston, a Fletcher class, charged the Japanese center force alone, firing torpedoes and 5-inch shells at cruisers and battleships. She was joined by Destroyer Hull, another Fletcher, and Destroyer Herman. The 3 destroyers attacked Battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, and heavy cruisers, launching torpedoes, firing guns, making smoke to cover the fleeing escort carriers. Johnston and Hull were sunk, but their attacks disrupted the Japanese formation, caused heavy cruisers Kumano, Suzuya, and Chikuma to turn away, and helped convince Admiral Kurita to withdraw before reaching the vulnerable escort carriers. 2 Fletcher-class destroyers, attacking with suicidal courage, had helped save an entire American invasion force. Nicholas missed that engagement. But 4 days later, on November 12, she sank Japanese submarine I-38 with depth charges. She survived 4 kamikaze attacks between November 27 and December 5. She bombarded Japanese naval facilities on Ormoc Bay. She provided fire support for the Lingayen Gulf landings in January 1945. By February 1945, Nicholas had participated in every major operation in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. She had sailed thousands of miles. She had fired tens of thousands of shells. She had rescued hundreds of sailors. She had survived bombs, torpedoes, kamikaze attacks, and the endless grinding strain of wartime operations. Her crew had been rotated multiple times. Her engines had been overhauled. Her radar had been upgraded. Her anti-aircraft battery had been strengthened as the kamikaze threat intensified. She was still fighting, still effective, still ready. That was the Fletcher-class destroyer. Not the fastest, not the heaviest armed, not the most technologically advanced, but reliable, tough, available in overwhelming numbers, supported by an industrial base that could repair damage, replace losses, and deliver ammunition, fuel, and supplies anywhere in the Pacific. The Japanese had built better individual destroyers. The Fubuki class in the 1920s had shocked the world with its firepower and speed. The Kajiro class in the 1930s had been among the finest destroyers afloat. But Japan had built them in small numbers and couldn't replace losses. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had fewer than 50 destroyers still operational. Most were damaged or fuel-starved. Spare parts were unavailable. Ammunition was rationed. Crews were exhausted. The United States had over 400 destroyers in commission. Fresh crews rotated from stateside training schools. Spare parts flowed from factories. Ammunition ships accompanied every task force. Tankers kept fuel bunkers full. The fleet repair ships Vulcan, Prometheus, and Ajax could overhaul destroyer machinery at forward bases, performing work that would have required a major shipyard in peacetime. This was industrial war, not brilliant tactics or superior training or technological breakthroughs, though those mattered. Industrial capacity. The ability to build weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. the ability to train sailors faster than they could be killed, the ability to deliver supplies faster than they could be consumed, the ability to absorb losses and continue advancing. Japan couldn't do it. They had fought brilliantly. Their destroyer crews had displayed extraordinary courage and skill. Their long lance torpedo was the finest weapon of its type in the world. Their night fighting doctrine had been superior to anything the Americans had developed before the war. But courage and skill couldn't overcome industrial mathematics. In September 1945, Nicholas was present in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender. She had survived the entire war. Of the 175 Fletcher-class destroyers built, 19 had been lost and 6 damaged beyond repair. 150 Fletchers survived the war. They had earned collectively more than 800 battle stars. 16 had received presidential unit citations. They had accounted for 29 confirmed submarine kills, hundreds of aircraft shot down, thousands of successful escort missions, and countless shore bombardment and surface action engagements. After the war, Nicholas remained in commission. She was decommissioned in June 1946, placed in reserve, then recommissioned in February 1951 for the Korean War. She served off Korea, providing gunfire support and screening carriers. She was decommissioned again in May 1960, then underwent fleet rehabilitation and modernization between December 1959 and July 1960. She served through the Vietnam War, becoming one of the first ships in Operation Market Time, patrolling the Vietnamese coast to prevent infiltration. USS Nicholas was finally decommissioned on December 7, 1970, after 27 years and 2 months of commissioned service. She was struck from the Navy list on January 31, 1972, and sold for scrap. She had served longer than most Fletchers, outlasting the war she was built to fight and the Cold War that followed. The Fletcher-class destroyer had been designed by committee, based on questionnaires sent to officers who actually operated destroyers at sea. It incorporated lessons learned from the last war and the first years of this one. It prioritized reliability over technological sophistication. It emphasized survivability over speed. It was built to be modified, upgraded, and adapted as technology evolved and tactical requirements changed. It was American naval engineering expressed in steel. Practical, effective, produced in overwhelming numbers, supported by an industrial base that enemies couldn't match and allies couldn't believe. When Admiral Nimitz visited Nicholas in January 1944 to present the Presidential Unit Citation, he told the crew their actions represented the standard that all destroyers should meet. But he might have said something else. That Nicholas and her sisters represented American industrial might. That the Fletcher-class destroyer was not just a weapon, but a statement. That the nation capable of building 175 destroyers in less than 3 years could not be defeated in an industrial war. The Germans had discovered this truth facing P-47 Thunderbolts over Europe. They learned that American industrial capacity would bury them under an avalanche of steel and lead. Japanese destroyer captains learned the same lesson in the waters off Guadalcanal, Kalimantan, Vella La Vella, Leyte, and Okinawa. They learned it when radar detected them at ranges their optical systems couldn't match. They learned it when 5-inch guns fired 100 rounds per minute and kept firing until the target was destroyed or withdrawn. They learned it when damaged Fletcher-class destroyers that should have sunk made it home for repairs and returned to service weeks later. Most of all, they learned it when they sank 1 Fletcher and 3 more appeared. The Japanese called it Atama ga Omoi, heavy at the head, top heavy. They were describing American industrial capacity, the ability to absorb losses and continue advancing. The overwhelming material superiority that turned battles of tactics and courage into mathematical exercises in steel tonnage and shell counts. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.